I went to the university library expecting a quiet afternoon, and instead I walked into a conversation that changed how I saw myself, my past, and the quiet spaces between generations. What began as a simple hello turned into an unexpected moment of honesty that stayed with me long after I left. Before we begin, let me ask you something. From which city are you watching us today? I love reading your comments and seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy thoughtful, real-life storytelling like this, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It truly helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Now, let me tell you what happened. I still remember the smell of old books and fresh coffee mixing in the air that afternoon. The university library had always felt like neutral ground to me, a place where time slowed down and no one expected anything from you. I was there because my son had asked me to drop off a book he'd forgotten at home. He was in his final year, busy, distracted, always moving. I told him I'd leave it at the front desk, but something about the quiet drew me in. I decided to sit for a while. I chose a table near the tall windows, the kind that let the late sunlight spill across the wooden surface. Dust floated gently in the light, and the low murmur of turning pages and distant footsteps felt almost comforting. I pulled out a notebook, not because I had something urgent to write, but because I liked the way it made me feel purposeful. That's when I noticed him. He hesitated a few steps away, holding a stack of books tighter than necessary. I recognized him immediately. He was one of my son's friends, someone I'd seen around the house a handful of times over the years. Always polite, always a little quiet. He was older now, clearly an adult, with that serious look students get when life starts feeling real. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked softly, as if unsure it was really me. I smiled and nodded. "You can call me Anne," I said. I'd never liked formal titles. They made distance where I preferred ease. He seemed relieved and asked if he could sit. There was nothing strange about it, not at first. Just two people sharing a table in a public place. He thanked me again for always being kind to him when he came over, which surprised me. I hadn't realized it had made an impression. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Classes, the weather, how crowded the campus had become. His voice was steady, but there was something under it, a tightness that reminded me of my own younger days, when I carried worries I didn't know how to name. Then he paused, fingers resting on the edge of one of his books. He looked around, making sure no one was listening, even though the library was open and safe and full of quiet witnesses. "Can I ask you something a little personal?" he said. I considered it carefully. I was a mother, yes, but I was also a woman who had lived long enough to understand that sometimes people just need to be heard. I told him he could, as long as he felt comfortable. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no shocking confessions. Instead, he spoke about pressure, about expectations, about feeling like he was supposed to have life figured out by now and realizing he didn't. He talked about his own parents, how they loved him but didn't quite understand the world he was stepping into. As he spoke, I felt something open inside me. Not attraction, not anything improper, but recognition. I remembered being his age, standing on the edge of adulthood, wishing someone older would tell me it was normal to feel unsure. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to fix anything. I just stayed present. At one point, he laughed quietly and said, "I don't know why I'm telling you all this." I did know. Sometimes a familiar face feels safer than a close one. Sometimes the right listener isn't the one you expect. "You don't have to have it all figured out," I told him. "Most of us never do. We just get better at carrying the questions." He nodded slowly, like he was storing that away. When the conversation ended, it ended naturally. He thanked me, stood up, and wished me a good afternoon. As he walked away, blending back into the rhythm of the library, I realized something had shifted. Not in him alone, but in me too. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the sunlight on the table, thinking about how unexpected connections can remind us of who we've been and who we still are. I hadn't gone to the library looking for meaning, but somehow meaning had found me there. I didn't expect to see him again so soon, and yet a week later I found myself back in the same library, almost by habit. My son hadn't asked me to drop anything off this time. I told myself I just wanted the quiet, the way the building seemed to hold its breath. Still, as I walked past the front desk and into the familiar rows of shelves, I wondered if part of me was curious. I chose a different table, farther from the windows. The weather had turned gray, and the light felt softer, more thoughtful. I'd opened the same notebook, flipping past blank pages until I reached the one where I'd written nothing but the date the last time. That empty space felt honest. I was midway through rereading an old entry when I heard a chair slide gently across the floor. "Hi, Anne," he said. I looked up, surprised despite myself. He smiled, a little more at ease than before, though his eyes still carried that searching look. This time he didn't ask if he could sit. He waited, giving me room to say no. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. "Of course," I said, closing the notebook. "How were you?" He shrugged, then sat down carefully. "Better, I think, after last time." There was something grounding about hearing that. It reminded me that listening, really listening, can matter more than we realize. We talked again, quietly, mindful of the space we were in. He told me he'd thought about our conversation more than he expected to. Not because it solved anything, he said, but because it made him feel less alone with his thoughts. I told him that was something I'd learned late in life. That loneliness doesn't always come from being by yourself. Sometimes it comes from feeling unseen. As the afternoon passed, students came and went, chairs creaked, pages turned. The library felt like a living thing around us, holding countless stories at once. Ours was just one of them, small and human. He asked about my life then, not in a probing way, but with genuine curiosity. I hesitated at first. Mothers get used to being the listeners, the supporters, the steady ones. We don't always get asked how we're really doing. I told him about raising my son on my own after his father, and I drifted apart. About how I'd learned to be practical, to keep moving forward. I didn't dwell on regrets, but I didn't hide them either. I spoke about the quiet moments that come when a child grows up and no longer needs you in the same way. He listened the way I had listened to him. Fully, respectfully. When I finished, he nodded and said, "That sounds harder than people realize." It was a simple sentence, but it landed deeply. Being seen goes both ways, I realized. It's not about age or roles. It's about presence. At one point, my phone buzzed with a message from my son, asking if I was nearby. I smiled at the timing. Life overlapping like that felt strangely right. I told his friend I needed to head out soon. Before we stood up, he thanked me again. This time there was more confidence in his voice. "I'm glad I ran into you," he said. "It helped more than you know." As I walked toward the exit, I felt lighter, but also thoughtful. This wasn't a friendship in the usual sense. It was something quieter, something rooted in respect and shared honesty. I knew there would need to be boundaries, clarity, and care, but I also knew that meaningful moments don't always announce themselves. Outside, the air was cool and smelled like rain. I paused on the steps, looking back at the tall doors of the library. I had gone in expecting silence. I came out carrying a reminder that connection can appear at any stage of life, often when we least expect it. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, but the conversations we'd shared stayed with me. I noticed it while folding laundry, while waiting at red lights, even while making my morning coffee. There was a quiet alertness in me, a sense that something had shifted internally. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted my life, but enough to make me more aware of the people around me, and of myself within those spaces. I didn't go back to the library with any expectations. That felt important. I didn't want to turn a meaningful moment into something forced or imagined. Still, when I found myself there again the following week, I chose a seat near the history section, where the shelves rose tall and steady, filled with stories that had survived far longer than any of us. He arrived later than I did. I noticed him first by the familiar, careful way he moved, like someone who didn't want to disturb the air around him. This time, he smiled more openly. There was an ease between us now, not familiarity exactly, but trust. We talked about his studies, and I could hear a difference in how he described them. Less like a burden, more like a path he was learning to walk at his own pace. He mentioned a professor who had challenged him, not just academically, but personally. I told him that the teachers who leave a mark are often the ones who ask us to think beyond ourselves. At some point, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. Do you ever feel like people stop seeing you once you reach a certain age? I didn't answer right away. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows, blurring the campus into shades of gray and green. I chose my words carefully. Yes, I said finally. Not all the time, but often enough that you notice it. I explained how women my age can become background figures without realizing when it started. How experience, wisdom, and resilience don't always show on the surface in ways the world recognizes. Saying it out loud felt oddly freeing. He listened, brow slightly furrowed, and then said, I see you. It wasn't said with drama or emphasis, just a statement. Honest, respectful. And in that moment, it meant more than compliments ever could. There was a pause after that, not uncomfortable, just full. The kind of silence that doesn't rush to be filled. I realized then that what made these conversations meaningful wasn't who we were to each other on paper, but how we met as people in those moments. 2 generations, 2 perspectives, meeting in the middle with care. Later, as we packed up our things, he mentioned he might be graduating sooner than expected. The idea of him moving on felt natural, the way chapters close when they've said what they needed to say. I felt proud of him, in a quiet, almost maternal way, but without crossing into anything that didn't belong. When we stood to leave, he thanked me again, but this time I stopped him gently. You don't need to keep thanking me, I said. Just take what you've learned and keep going. He nodded, and I watched him walk away down the long aisle of shelves. I stayed a moment longer, hand resting on the back of my chair, taking in the familiar smells and sounds. The library had become more than a building to me. It was a place where reflection had turned into growth. As I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement glistened, reflecting the sky in fragments. I took a deep breath and continued on, aware that not all meaningful connections are meant to last forever, but some are meant to change us quietly, and that is enough. Time has a way of smoothing things out, of placing moments where they belong. By the time the semester neared its end, my visits to the university became less frequent. My son was busy with final projects and plans that stretched beyond the campus, and I was learning how to step back, how to let his life move forward without hovering at the edges. On my last visit to the library that spring, I didn't expect to run into anyone I knew. I went because I wanted to say goodbye to the place itself. The building had become a quiet marker in my own timeline, a space where listening had reminded me of who I was when no one was asking anything of me. I walked slowly, fingers brushing the spines of books as I passed. The afternoon light felt warmer than it had weeks earlier, and the air carried the soft energy of endings and beginnings mixed together. I was near the exit when I heard my name. He stood a few steps away, a single folder tucked under his arm. He looked different somehow, straighter, calmer, like someone who had made peace with the fact that answers don't always arrive all at once. I was hoping I'd see you, he said. We stood near the tall windows, not sitting this time. There was no need. He told me he'd accepted a position out of state, something related to his field that excited him and scared him in equal measure. I smiled and told him that sounded exactly right. I wanted to thank you, he said, and then stopped himself, smiling. I know. You told me I don't have to. But I want to, he continued. You helped me see that it's okay to slow down and pay attention. That meant a lot. I felt that familiar warmth, not pride exactly, but gratitude. The kind that comes from knowing you were present when it mattered. I told him I was glad our paths had crossed, and that I believed he'd do well, not because life would be easy, but because he'd learned how to reflect. There was a pause, and then he asked how I was doing. Really doing. I thought about it for a moment, about the quiet evenings at home, about rediscovering interests I'd set aside years ago, about learning to sit with myself without feeling restless or invisible. I'm doing well, I said honestly. I'm learning that this stage of life isn't an ending. It's a widening. He nodded, as if committing that idea to memory. We said goodbye simply. No promises to stay in touch, no dramatic parting. Just a shared understanding that what we'd exchanged didn't need to be carried forward to remain meaningful. As I walked out of the library for the last time that season, I realized something important. Connection doesn't always announce itself with noise or intensity. Sometimes it arrives quietly, asks us to listen, and leaves us changed in ways that only reveal themselves later. Driving home, I felt a steady sense of peace. Not the absence of questions, but the comfort of knowing I could hold them. I had been a listener, a guide for a brief moment, and in return I had been reminded that I still mattered, that my voice and presence carried weight. Now, when I think back on that afternoon when everything began, I don't think about the surprise of it. I think about the respect, the honesty, the simple human act of one person opening up and another choosing to stay. And I carry that with me, grateful for the reminder that growth doesn't belong to the young alone. It belongs to anyone willing to pause, to listen, and to meet another person where they are.